Greetings from Austin, Texas. I'm Victoria DiFrancesco Soto, and I'm the Assistant Dean for Civic Engagement at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. Welcome to In the Arena. This year, the LBJ School turns 50, and in celebrating our 50th anniversary, we have launched the series, In the Arena, where we celebrate and commemorate folks, policymakers in the arena who help make our nation better. And speaking of birthdays, it's not just our 50th birthday here at the LBJ School. It is also the 100th birthday of the women's right to vote. So this has been a very special week. Today, a very special day where we're celebrating Women's Equality Day. And in celebrating this special birthday, 100 years of having the right to vote, I couldn't think of a better way to celebrate it than by talking about voting itself. And we are, just in case you're counting, 68 days away from November's presidential election. And in talking about voting and digging into the issue of engagement, I am absolutely thrilled to be co-hosting this special In the Arena session with the Annette Strauss Institute for Civic Life. My Office of Civic Engagement at the LBJ School and the Annette Strauss Center across campus, it's a walkable distance of about 15 minutes. We're proud to be able to focus our energies on mobilizing not just the campus community, but also the wider Texas and national community and how to best get engaged. So regardless of what party one affiliates with, the issue is to get you up and engaged and mobilized, and always, but especially in this upcoming election. And in putting together different workshops, different events, different programming to get folks engaged, we wanted to kick off this burst of 2.5 months left to Election Day with this panel on voting. So for our panel today, we are very, very lucky to have a proud UT alum, both of undergrad and of law school, Erin Geiger Smith, who just wrote a book entitled Thank You for Voting, The Maddening, Enlightening, Inspiring Truth About Voting in America. Erin will be joined by Alexis Tatum, a recent grad from UT who holds a journalism and Plan 2 honors. She was also a member of last year's cohort of Texas Civic Ambassadors, and this is out of the Annette Strauss Institute. And Alexis is preparing to enter law school sometime post-pandemic. So I think a lot to talk about here with Erin offline. And we are also joined by Claudia Sandoval, a second-year LBJ student and one of my students as well. Claudia is a native of Dallas and a proud daughter of Mexican immigrants. And before coming to the LBJ School, she served on the Cockrell Hill City Council, making her the youngest elected official at the time in all of Dallas County. So it will be an interesting conversation, to say the least, there with these three amazing ladies. But before turning it over to them, I wanted to turn it over to my colleague and friend, Susan Nold, from the Annette Strauss Institute for Civic Life. When it comes to engagement and civic engagement here on campus and in Texas, she is one of my sheroes. So Susan, the floor is yours, and thank you again for doing this with us.
Thank you so much for having us be part of this event, Vicki. It's a real honor for me to kick off this fall semester at UT. Partnering with the LBJ School. I have such great respect for everything that you all do. And it's a real honor to be part of this event, this In the Arena event. It's also fun for me because Erin and I were classmates at the University of Texas School of Law. So we've known each other about 20 years, and seeing what she has done since that time is such an inspiration to me. It's a true privilege to be here. As Vicki said, the Annette Strauss Institute is in the Moody College of Communications. We're across campus from the LBJ School. And I want to acknowledge we're also celebrating a milestone year. 2020 is our 20th anniversary of the founding of the Institute. So we have had an exciting year, interrupted a little bit, as all of our years has been, by the pandemic, of celebrating 20 years of the Annette Strauss Institute. So with that, I want to turn it over to my good friend and someone I have great respect for, Erin.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan. It's exciting to see you over Zoom always. It's a true honor for me to be here. I love the university and am, as Dr. Soto said, a proud graduate. And congratulations to everyone for making it to the first day of school. Usually you don't need congratulations for that, but this feels like a year where things aren't so simple. So I hope they become more simple as it goes on, and I'm thrilled to be here. I'm mostly looking forward to answering Alexis and Claudia's questions and questions from you guys who are watching. So I'm going to just really quickly give you a little background about me and how I came to write this book and what's in the book, so you can know the breadth of questions you can ask. So I am from Liberty, Texas, which is about an hour northeast of Houston. They are in hurricane prep today, so fingers crossed about that. And so going from this tiny town to UT was a big leap for me. I think that my freshman year psychology class was bigger than my entire high school. That's not an exaggeration, it really was. And, so everything felt eye-opening, but I sort of took to the vastness right away. And I was a journalism major, and looking back on that time, it's really when I learned the fundamentals of writing clearly and reporting and what questions to ask, and that it's okay to ask a dumb question because sometimes that gets you the best answer. I learned how to write headlines, which whether when I was a lawyer or now telling a story, learning how to summarize something quickly and sharply and in a compelling way, that's, it was maybe 5 days of a journalism class, and it stuck with me this entire time. If I have any regret while I was an undergrad, it was that because I was guarding my GPA so closely to go to UT Law, as much as I loved journalism, I was sort of scared of making it a career. It's embarrassing to admit, but I was. And so I thought law school would be a great way to do the research and writing that I loved as well. And so when I was in undergrad, I didn't take advantage of all of the reporting and writing opportunities that there were. And so don't be me. While you're there, take advantage of absolutely everything that you can. After undergrad, I went to law school, and that of course furthered my ability to ask questions, really ask big questions. It sounds, I don't admit to always having the answer, but I really felt law school served to help me think critically no matter what I was doing. And it was also, importantly to this book, my first introduction to real study of voting rights and civil rights law. Even though that wasn't what I focused on, the law school gave us such deep dives in those areas if you wanted to, and so that was a really wonderful thing. After law school, I practiced law at large law firms in Houston and Austin and New York, but just couldn't get the idea of being a journalist out of my head. And so I made the leap, decided to go back to what I had loved in college. Because I had not kept up with those writing clearly and concisely and kept up with my journalistic writing skills, I went to 1 year of Columbia Journalism School here in New York, just to kind of get back in the game. After that, was a reporter at Business Insider, and then ended up as a reporter at Reuters for several years covering legal news. So still combining my undergrad and law school in doing that, and I loved it. And Reuters was really fast-paced, but after a few years, I wanted time to write longer features and decided to freelance. I'm kind of telling you all this so you know that all careers are windy. I'm sure you're already figuring it out, but mine especially was. So I freelanced mostly for the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, writing about, truly everything, writing about entrepreneurs, writing about consumer trends, writing about fitness, writing about several years ago when podcasts all of a sudden exploded, writing about podcasts, writing about books. And I was moving happily along until 2016. And then that election felt like such an earth-shattering event. For the very first time, and this may sound strange, but for the first time, my hometown of Liberty and New York City felt like different universes. And so I kind of wanted to explore that more. And then also as a reporter, it felt like there was one big story. And you know, when you're a reporter, you want to get in the game. And I just had so many questions about that election specifically. What happened with polling? What happened with the media's role? I wanted to learn more about the Electoral College and sort of its history, and was it coming to an end or is it not? And so as I tried to figure out how to make my way into writing in that area, I saw on Instagram, where we find all our good ideas, the novelist Ann Patchett said she was writing a book about women in voting. And because I had written a lot of book stories for the Wall Street Journal, I felt comfortable reaching out to her publicist and just saying, look, if Ann needs help conducting research or doing some background interviews, I would love to do it. And I saw it as a side project. And it's a very long story, which I can tell you later at a different time. But the short of it is that research project became this book, which I'll hold up because my publisher really likes me to do that. And to kind of circle back to UT a minute about the book before I tell you what the book is about, last June, as I was rushing to try to finish the first draft, I needed, you know, some college level 19-hour cram sessions. And I came and stayed with my junior and senior year roommate there in Austin and finished the first draft and went to print out what was then like 260, way too long, 260-ish pages for this book. And as I printed it out, I ended up at the Kinko's on Guadalupe near campus. And I realized I was sort of in the shadow of the College of Communications and, you know, right near Consolving, where I spent my freshman year. And I had just that morning had coffee with my freshman year roommate. And, you know, I just felt sort of overwhelmed of how everything started for me there at the College of Communications. And here I was printing out this book in severe need of editing, but it at least was a book. So to tell you a little bit about what the book is, the goal is to increase voter turnout, but I wanted to give you as much information in an accessible and concise way. So it's in 3 sections. The first is how different groups got the right to vote. So Black Americans, Native Americans, different immigrant groups, 18-year-olds, and then of course I have a chapter on women. As was mentioned earlier, today's the 100th anniversary of the signing when the 19th Amendment became official, acknowledging women's right to vote. But of course, as I'm sure we'll discuss, it acknowledged the right, but certainly didn't protect that right for all women. The book also talks about current voter suppression and ways we can do better, how some states are working to make voting more convenient, and then other states continue to struggle in that area, shall we say. The middle section is current get out the vote movements, just innovative ways that people are using social media and what I like to call positive peer pressure to encourage others to vote. So there are some famous names like Michelle Obama and the actress and activist Yara Shahidi, but mostly it's people who just saw a problem with low voter turnout and wanted to figure out a way to make it better. I talk also about corporations and how they're doing better to promote voting. There's a chapter on the language of voting, where ballot came from, why we say party ticket, and then these sort of really in the weeds but interesting studies on what gets people actually out of their house or this year to their mailbox. And then it wraps up with explainer chapters on topics that I think confuse even the most educated voter. So I talk about gerrymandering, news literacy, polling, and the Electoral College. I think my last note about UT is that it's where I really learned to read the news and to have a wide media diet. And that has served me well since then, and certainly helped me write this news literacy chapter. And so that's the book. The goal is both accessible for any first-time voter, and then if you're a habitual go every time voter, just things that might make you feel more empowered in getting others to vote. So that's it. And I'm excited to answer the questions from Alexis and Claudia.
Thank you, Erin. That was a really great overview. And so we want to jump right in and talk about what, in your opinion, is the ideal voting scenario to ensure that everybody has access to the polls. You know, you talk a little bit about, you know, early voting and how some states like Texas actually have longer early voting periods, you know, different registration methods, things like that. So what, if we could envision the perfect, you know, voting scenario, what would that look like?
That's a big question and a great question. No one has asked me that. You know, I think ideal would require us going a long way back and having each state have very similar voting laws. A huge problem for any voting group or voting advocate that tries to not focus on just one state has to caveat absolutely everything, as I will many times today, with, but check what's happening in your state, check what, you know, your local area is doing. So ideally we have more cohesiveness between the states. But it needs to be a combination of all of those things that you mentioned. We would love for every state to have an extensive early voting period. We would love for every state to either have, you know, to not cut registration off 30 days ahead, as Texas and other states do, is a long way. And some people get interested in the election late. And if on October 15th, you have an 18-year-old that's like, wait, I do, you know, or not even wait, I do want to vote, time to sign up, and it's too late. So I think in an ideal world, you have same-day registration, you have, you just make it easy for people to know all of the rules. And so that also involves a lot of education. And then in situations like now, when we have so much discussion and debate over vote by mail, you know, that's a thing that was available easily to people in 5 states and available to people in every state in certain situations. And if that was a system that was already being pushed and utilized and educated about, we wouldn't be kind of in this mess. So, you know, that's, I threw a lot of things out there. I realized that wasn't like a coherent list, but overall, we want voting to be easy to understand. We want it to be as convenient as possible. And that involves doing all of those things together. But what really needs to be eliminated, in my opinion, are the really long cutoff for registration. You know, that would go a long way into making things a little better.
Okay, so our next question for you is that many people, especially young voters, it seems lately, are politically engaged but increasingly skeptical about the effectiveness of voting. It's become apparent for a lot of people that they don't feel represented adequately by either major party. And so, especially when it comes to this presidential election. But what do you say to those people who are engaged, they read the news, they care about politics, they care about what's happening in their community, but they don't think that voting in this election will make much of a difference for them?
Right. You know, number one, my sort of take on us having the problem of low voter turnout, and especially young people not voting enough, is not to be blamed on the young people. I think that those of us who vote all the time and who it's easy for need to do a much better job educating and motivating people as to explain why. You know, one can't solve the problem of neither presidential candidate being your cup of tea. I mean, no one should try to talk you into that. But the fact is, one of them is gonna be it. And you probably do like one of them more than the other. One comes closer to your ideals. And even if the presidential candidate doesn't come closer to your ideals, they are going to lead a party to have a whole lot of control and send things in a certain direction. So number one, when it comes to president, you just got to choose someone who's the closest to it and go for it. Do not give up your voice. But I also think that anyone who's feeling that way should really think about how the president is not the most important. I know that's strange to say, but it is an extremely important thing, but you have to think about the whole ballot. And if you don't show up just because you don't like the people at the top, you're giving up your ability to choose, you know, possibly senators, depending on, you know, what's going on in your state. So maybe senators are up, congressmen are definitely up, your mayor might be up, your city council people, you know, however whatever the combo is on your ballot. But if the coronavirus has taught us anything, it's that local leaders have an enormous effect on our lives. They just do. They impact your healthcare, they impact your education. They make decisions that affect you way more than the president does. And so you have to show up for those people too. And then the other thing is, you know, going back to president, people talk a lot about red state versus blue state. And, you know, if you are in one that is all red or all blue, and especially if you're in the minority party in that state, it's still so important to show up because it lets people know the size of the opposition. And the opposition is never going to be in charge if all of the people who believe that way don't show up. And it also matters how money is distributed for congressional races and all of those things. So many things play into whether you show up or not. And you just don't want to give up that voice, especially if you're someone who is politically active and engaged. You can do all of those other things, continue doing all of those other things, but don't give up this one really important thing, because whether you like the people or not, they make decisions that affect you. And no matter, certainly, especially this year, these candidates are far enough apart and the parties they represent are far enough apart. You know, give it some thought and choose which works for you. But I hate to hear about people giving up their vote because they feel like it won't matter or do enough. It does matter, and it especially doesn't matter if it doesn't exist.
Thanks, Erin. That reminds me of a saying that I had in the work that I used to do in consulting, which is done it perfect, get in the way of better. That was something we always told our clients is, you know, just because you're not getting what you want right away, it doesn't mean, you know, you can't keep making progress towards it little by little.
Yeah, the other way to say it is don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. And, you know, a lot of good can get done by people who aren't perfect.
Yeah, thank you. And so I also want to touch a little bit on, so chapter 5, you talk about making voting their business. And you discuss strategies that businesses use to encourage voter turnout within their employees. And one of your primary examples was Patagonia closing all of their offices nationwide during the midterm elections in 2018 to ensure that their employees had time to go vote. So as we prepare to graduate and rejoin the workforce full-time, what are some strategies that we can share with our own employers or that we can try to implement ourselves to help our colleagues exercise their rights?
That's a great question. And of all of the things that I walked away with, my takeaways for myself from this book, the impact that companies large and small can have in the way that the woman who led this initiative at Patagonia put it is change the culture around voting. People interact, I used to say go to work, but people interact with their employees 5 days a week, if not more, and it's a big part of people's life. And so if voting is made a part of that, it can have a huge difference. So to go to Patagonia, what they do is close their stores on election day and headquarters just to make sure everyone sees that as a day to vote. Of course, this election, especially early voting, is very important. So the idea of giving people time off to vote doesn't mean you have to close down on election day, but just encouraging employees that, you know, you feel it's part of a corporation's civic duty and an American civic duty to make sure and vote, and making it easy for them to do so. Companies can also just have a point person. You know, if you're a small company, you need one person. If you're geographically diverse, a person in every spot. But a person who is just willing to pull together deadlines, notify people of their registration deadline, notify when early voting dates are and what options there are in that state to vote. You know, do you have mail? Do you not? What are your, again, early voting days? That sort of thing. Just keeping people updated on what the deadlines are is a huge help and a pretty easy help. You can also go a step further by having someone like the League of Women Voters, or some other local organization that's nonpartisan come and register people. It's also a way that companies can set, have a little fun with it, set competitions between departments for the most pledges to vote or the most new registrations. Like, funnily enough, what companies who are really active in this say is one of the few things that costs them money but is worth doing is creating like company voting swag. So, Patagonia votes, or, this year create a Zoom background that says your company votes, and have people, publicize that on your own social media and have employees do the same. Larger corporations that have customers or fans can also do a lot to encourage their fans to vote. And then this year, it really has been a build from 2016 to 2018 to now. Companies have been involved in promoting voting a long time. Some companies like Blue Cross Blue Shield have like robust decades long, but it really is a building thing. And this year, companies are doing their part to notify and support vote by mail, or they're also promoting early voting, like taking a public stance, spending ad dollars on promoting early voting, or encouraging younger employees to not just have the day off, but be poll workers. So there's really so many things that companies can do, and it should be and is nonpartisan. So sometimes, companies who do this, and business organizations who encourage this, hear pushback about companies are afraid for it to be partisan, but it's really not. Voting isn't partisan. We should want absolutely everyone to do it. And I think it's a great thing for, in interviews, or, as you follow up and learn more, to ask what they do. And if they don't do something, ask if they would be open to you taking that on. I think it shows, number one, really great initiative, but it's also a way to get to know your company better. And for company leaders, kind of setting the tone from the top this election season, send out an email saying, I vote, here's my voting plan. Would love for you to make a voting plan too. There's a lot that's happening in that world, and it's really fun and really encouraging.
Thank you for the response. So our next question is more about news literacy. You dedicated an entire chapter to news literacy and the role of the press in informing people about elections, and that role towards civic engagement. So why do you think a healthy news consumption is so important to voting? And what advice do you have for people who are still trying to navigate dense news cycles and find trustworthy news sources, especially now when you have, it's gotten more political and people are actively saying, do not trust this source over another?
Right. It's very, I included the chapter because I think the news can be so overwhelming right now, and especially in election season. There's studies after study that show as you get closer to election day, people just have news fatigue. They feel like they just can't bear it. And because, one of the beauties and evils of the internet is that you're constantly barraged with information, and you just don't always know where it's coming from. And so my goal with the news literacy chapter was not to say, this source over another, but instead to really drive home that when you're looking at a piece of information, and if you recognize the source, that's a good first step. But if you don't, kind of thinking through where it comes from. That's the first thing about news, is learning, making sure you know where it comes from, and kind of researching, who's behind it. I am always a big advocate for reading the stories by the person who was in the room, by the reporter who was in the room and has spent time on that beat and knows what's happening. I think local news is so important. You know, in any scenario that's a local event, the reporters who are on the ground know that better. I talk a little bit about understanding a news organization's history, but that certainly doesn't mean that new news organizations, especially local news, aren't trustworthy. It's just, it does require you do a little bit of work sometimes. But, you know, I say reading the news is a voter's superpower, because looking at a wide variety of sources, you know, is so important. Because number one, if you read something crazy, if something strikes you as, wow, that is odd, see if other places that are known to report the facts also have it. If anything is a big deal, other news organizations are rushing to match that as quickly as humanly possible. And if it's some big crazy story and lots of places don't have it within an hour, it's probably not accurate. And certainly if they don't have it the next day. So I think you don't want to get stuck into reading only news that supports your own ideas. I think everyone needs unbiased news sources, and I still consider newspapers and their websites and many magazines and their websites to really take that position. I think that there are many reasons that good old-fashioned reporting is very important, but also when you're trying to figure out who to vote for, do find trusted sources that usually support that align with your views, so you can kind of understand what they're saying, but back that up with factual news from places that have been around a while and people who have been around a while. I don't know if that answered your question. That was more a diatribe on, I know that it's difficult. And sometimes instead of just opening up Facebook or opening up Twitter and thinking about what comes to you, it's important to pause and think, what information do I need to know to vote? What do I care about? And then go seek what the candidate says on that topic. Of course, their websites also can give you an idea of what they consider to be the most important thing. But then take that information and see what they've actually done, see what laws they've introduced or how they've acted in the business world. You know, the news really is to serve you and give you the information you need to vote. But if you're looking only at what people post on Facebook, you're probably missing a lot of the stories. And that's not just because, you know, that's not a knock on Facebook. It's just that you don't know the person's posting it. What's their bias, or where did they find it? Tracking down where something came from really is probably my biggest news tip. And don't just read the headlines.
And to your point about accessing those local reporters who are actually in the room and watching things happen in real time, they're on social media too. They access these platforms just like we do. And so it's a little easier than we realize sometimes to see exactly where that information came from.
Yeah.
Tons of reporters, they keep it in their bio where they work and what they're doing.
It's a really great point, is that almost all reporters have to have, you know, some, and there are always exceptions to the rule, but nearly everybody has a presence on Twitter and a lot on Instagram and the other platforms too. And it does show you sort of how they built the story often, or if they've been writing about this for years. And that's also a way, if it's a news organization that you're not clear about, if you look at the reporter and see what their background is, that can also, you know, help your comfort level or let you know to steer clear. But that is, you're absolutely right. One of the big pluses of social media is that it allows us all to be a little bit more transparent about where we work and where things came from.
Thank you, Erin. And we are getting a lot of questions from attendees, so I want to throw one of these in there. This question is from Tom. We often hear that the poor do not vote. Why? Is it that poor people do not feel that they have a stake in the system, or is it that there are also just too many barriers to overcome?
I think it's definitely the barrier issue. You're absolutely right that people of the lowest income have the lowest turnout, and the space between those with the highest income, the percentage which they vote, and the lowest is huge. I'm hesitant to say exact numbers because it's been a while since I've looked at that stat, but it's honestly something like 80 to 30. I mean, it's a huge, huge difference. I think that it's barriers, and if you were struggling in your day-to-day life to make so many things work, to make enough to meet your rent, you're also, if you're a lower income person, that likely means that your life just isn't as flexible. So if you're a shift worker and it doesn't align for you to be able to go vote, you probably don't vote. I mean, that is a problem. One of the most sort of heartening studies that I came across in writing this book is this organization called Nonprofit Vote. And they started to do voter registration initiatives at different social organizations and different charities. So at intake, when they were, trying to figure out what the person needed or had, or all of those things, they would include asking if they were registered to vote, and if not, help them do that. Not only are you registered, but do you have an address change, which frequent change of addresses is also often an issue for those in the lowest income bracket. So it's access, but what they found from this sort of meeting them where they are for talking about voter registration, and in one example was childcare classes. It's just bringing the idea to people and making it easier and convenient for them. And it made a huge difference in turnout. I mean, it was certainly a relatively small study, but it was across multiple states and several thousands of people. And, just like with young people and teaching them to vote in high school or college, it's really going to people where they are and making it convenient, because anytime you're too busy or too stressed, voting can sort of fall to the wayside. And so, it's among the many problems that we have to deal with. I don't think it's a lack of understanding that the system affects them, because often they're interacting regularly with the system. But we need to do better about helping people understand their power, but utilizing that power.
Yeah, it's definitely an all hands on deck kind of situation. We can all pitch in and help that. So another question from Q&A from Cole. He said, Erin, you mentioned in your book that large-scale voter registration efforts are bipartisan. Do you predict that voter registration will remain nonpartisan, or do you believe that voter registration efforts will become a partisan issue? And if so, how do we combat that?
I think I would say that they are both already partisan and nonpartisan. So there are a ton of nonpartisan organizations that try to get out the vote, but then there's also, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and all the factions within those also have very robust get out the vote and registration efforts. So it's not that partisan people aren't seeking to register voters, but what I guess I tried to sort of hammer in the idea of that just registering to vote and making it easy shouldn't be partisan. But there are many registration issues that are already political. So, some states have automatic voter registration, where when you interact with a state agency like the DMV, some states it's an opt-in, some states it's an opt-out, but by filling out the information for your driver's license, that information that applies to voting is automatically sent to the voter registration organization in the state, or agency in the state. And so you're automatically registered to vote. Whereas in other states, like Texas is a non-AVR state, you have to fill out the separate form. So the idea of AVR is it kind of removes that form. And in states that have enacted that in recent years, it has had its bumps like everything, but has definitely raised voter registration and just taken away one of those barriers. But in states that don't want to have it, it's a concern of voter fraud or non-citizens registering, that sort of thing. So there are many issues about registration that are politicized, you know, whether or not to have same-day registration is that same issue. You know, Tennessee recently passed a law that's wrapped up in all sorts of litigation, but that tried to tamp down on large-scale voter registration. So if too many of the forms had mistakes, then the people doing the voter registration could face fines. So it's that sort of thing that is politicized. I would certainly like that to be toned down. I don't know if we're still on a ramp up of that or not. But, you know, I think the most important thing for a citizen to do is keep an eye when possible on voter registration law or policy changes, and really think who that might affect. So think who it's going to help, who it might hurt, and sort of what the point is, what the stated point is, and if that makes sense. But you know, one of the things that a person who ran Obama's ground campaign in 2012 said about registration efforts that really stuck with me was, you know, he was like, if everyone had automatic voter registration, all of these organizations could save so much money on the register part of things and just focus on get out the vote. And I think that's really true. I mean, if you got to skip all of these calls for registration, it probably would make a big difference in turnout.
Thank you, Erin. And one other question that we have from the audience, this one is from, oh, it's anonymous, but would you support new policies or laws that reduce obstacles for third parties to get on the ballot so voters are given more options? That is one of the reasons people don't vote, as they are only provided two options.
Okay. Let me think. I guess I should say that I am not an expert on all the barriers for third parties to get on. So I can't speak to the particular policies of what works and what doesn't, but I think we all can agree there are many barriers to that. I think from the voting perspective, there are ideas that make having third parties on the ballot more palatable for everyone. I mean, you know, certainly one can disagree with the term of palatable, but I mean, something that would make everyone more comfortable of having third party candidates on the ballot, because they're often kept off so they don't theoretically take away from, you know, the Republican or Democratic candidate. The parties like to get all the votes that they can. So one thing that's interesting in that realm is this idea of ranked choice voting, which some cities have used on a local level for a long time and has been used on a statewide level really recently, and some states even used it in the primary election. And that's the idea of voters being able to rank the candidates. So if you have candidate A, B, C, and D, you say which one you like first, second, third, and fourth. And when they count the votes, if no candidate gets more than 50%, they throw out the votes for, let's say in this case, so candidate D came in fourth, throw out the votes for candidate D, and everyone who chose candidate D first, their second choice gets the vote on the second round. And ideas like that are helpful for people who support third-party candidates, because they get to have their vote, but it's also like they're not throwing away a vote. And so, you know, I think if more states and cities adopted that idea, that maybe we would see, you know, less pushback for third party candidates. It's still, ranked choice voting is obviously still not used widely in the country, but like in New York City, we just adopted it. And I guess, is it 2018? Anyway, we will soon next year. Next year, I think, is the first time. No, it's not going to make it on the ballot this time, but for some city elections, we'll use ranked choice voting. So New York City doing it, obviously, that's a large city taking a foray into it. So I think that's something that's only going to grow.
Okay, we have another audience question from Tanya, and her question actually touches a little bit on the first part of your book, which goes over the history of voting in the country and comparing it to other democratic countries. So what do you think the primary reason that other democratic countries have such a high voter turnout as compared to the United States? If you could boil it down to one major reason, one or two, what would that be?
I do think, I mean, in some other countries, people are required to vote. It's a law that they vote. It doesn't carry huge fines, but I think it, makes, helps with the mind of making sure you show up. So that's obviously something that's very different in the United States, and I don't anticipate us having. But our history is just one of, we started with a very small group of people who can vote. Every time it was expanded, people tried to narrow that expansion. We saw over and over when the 14th and 15th Amendment gave Black men the right to vote, that time period, women could have been given the vote at that same time, and they weren't, and that battle would go on way longer. And even as the 14th and 15th Amendment were passed and Black men were supposed to have the right to vote, Jim Crow laws immediately started cropping up. There was sort of a renaissance period during the Reconstruction era where we had 2,000 Black men that were elected to local, state, and even national office. And then when that period ended very quickly, and around a decade, Jim Crow laws really tamped down African American participation for years and years. That was true with limiting when immigrants could obtain citizenship to keep them from voting. The language barriers, the literacy tests, all of these things that we had just kept people from voting for a long time. And even when groups had the right to vote, that didn't immediately mean that those groups, voted en masse. It took women a long time to sort of own their power. And even today we see that Asian American turnout rate is disproportionately low because it was, into the 1950s before some Asian Americans had a right to citizenship and vote, or Asian immigrants who wanted to become Asian Americans. And so systemic problems last a long time, and they hurt our turnout rate then, and they hurt our turnout rate now. So I just think if Americans would be a lot more honest about the difficulties in our system, and that past wrongs we are still working to come back from. And in a way, like some of it is not at all nefarious. I mean, 18-year-olds have only had the right to vote since 1971, 72 officially, but when it got going in 71. So it just takes a long time. I mean, there are many reasons why people don't vote, and we can't know all of them, but we can try to address as many as we can. And we are seeing, there was greater turnout rate in 2018 from the 2014 to 2018 numbers for young people. So 18 to 29-year-olds comparing midterm to midterm, it jumped from around 20% up to 36%. So that's a 16 percentage point change. That is a huge jump in a 4-year period of turnout for 18 to 29-year-olds. So there is movement and reasons to be hopeful, but we do have a long way to go. And, the reasons are many, and most having to do with our history, and then with current laws that make it harder for people to vote and register.
Yeah, and kind of to touch on that point still about young people voting, we do have a question from Margaret. What do we know specifically about expected voting behavior of young people, which you kind of touched on is increasing, but is there anything else that we know about their behavior in this upcoming election compared to recent elections?
So we know that young people are way more interested and way more excited. You know, these are all data points that the numbers are definitely inflated, because many of us, they say, are you going to vote? Yeah, sure, you know. But the numbers right now are huge. It's like 71% of this I believe it just came out this week, but 18 to 24-year-olds, so the youngest voters, but say they're going to vote. That would be an astronomical jump. I don't think it's unfortunately going to be anything like that. But we are seeing increased registrations among young people. A caveat with that is that registration struggled hugely during the coronavirus and was much behind this year than it had been previous years, but it's starting to go up a little bit. And in swing states, especially, seeing more registrations among young people. So I think there's a lot of reason to be hopeful. There are so many question marks with this that it is hard to say anything definitively. Turnout for young people 18 to 29 in 2016 was about 46%. I really, truly, sincerely think that we're going to see a real jump in that. And I'll be so disappointed if I'm wrong.
Okay, so we have time for about one more question. And I guess as simply as you could put it, what do you think somebody should be doing right now to ensure that their vote is counted with this election coming up, since we do have these existing barriers in voter suppression, but also new things like the situation with the United States Postal Service and of course this pandemic. So what kind of advice would you have for someone who really wants to make sure their vote is counted in this election?
I mean, the first thing I want to say is, if you give yourself plenty of time, if you make a voting plan, if you figure out what the best method for you to vote is, your vote will count. So we do have to put much more thought into it this year than we have before. I'm not trying to sugarcoat that, but I don't think we should worry about our vote counting if you do the work. So if you, right now, you need to make sure you're registered where you're going to vote. Check that today. Make sure it's up to date. If you think you're already registered, check it anyway. It's important to, to confirm that you're registered. I like to say early and often. If you are going to vote absentee in the state that wherever you've come from, check those rules. For vote by mail, you need to request your ballot as soon as possible, fill it out as soon as possible. If you are mailing it in, if you're in Austin and you're voting in Ohio, just make sure you follow those directions specifically. Make sure you sign it everywhere you're supposed to, and in a signature that matches as closely as possible the one in your voter roll. So just follow those steps. And then for other, in Texas, it's still, you guys aren't going to have a robust vote by mail. So if you do think you're eligible, follow all those steps again. Make sure, vote by mail states, make sure you can track your ballot or call to make sure they got it or that it's been counted. And then in Texas, you have a long early voting period. Talk to your friends, everybody decide when you're going to early vote, and then show up and do it. Wear a mask, bring some hand sanitizer. But if you make a plan to vote and make sure you have everything you need, make sure you have the proper ID. There's the League of Women Voters website, vote411.org, breaks down every state. You can search by state and they get into really great detail. And so that everything question you have should be there, and just make sure you make a plan and follow the rules and that you vote. Just make sure you do it. Give yourself time. Everything this year should be early. Don't wait till election day this year. Early, early, early. Mail early, vote early. Get it done.
Well, I think that with that call, I want to close our session, but not without first pointing out that in our chat box, we put a bunch of resources in terms of getting involved, getting engaged, getting registered. One organization that we've teamed up with at the LBJ School is with Power the Polls. We need younger poll workers, so please engage with us. We'll have all of this information up on our website in addition to this episode. And thank you so much to all of you, to Erin, to Alexis, to Claudia, to helping us unpack the beauty of voting, the complexity of it, but in unpacking it, it makes it more approachable. We're gonna have our voting plan, Erin, as you set out, and hopefully we can debrief post-election to see how we did. And with that, I will sign off from the LBJ School and the Annette Strauss Institute. Hasta luego. Bye-bye.
Thank you.